I think one of the things that the publisher also early on asked was, who's this book for? And I actually said, everybody. And they're like, no, 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 you can't do that. It doesn't sell like that. I said, but really, I want everyone to be able to pick it up and read. And I thought about, my dad, who I want him to be able to pick it up and actually read. I want my nephew to pick it up and read and actually get it without having to go to like a dictionary. So that's how it actually began. And maybe that's why it's attractive to people who just want to learn lightheartedly.
And I want to congratulate Haesun because she was one of the top 2 speakers in the recent WebEx summit. So big round of applause, yes, for Haesun. She had 13,000 people register for her session. And 2,000 turned up, but it means that 13,000 probably listened to it. So
it's not my fault.
So what's wonderful is she's getting a message about solution focus out into the world big time, which is awesome. So Haesun's a communication scientist, educator, and author of several collaborative books, PhD in adult education and community development. And she believes conversations can cure the world. She's also the author of the Dialogic orientation quadrant, which has made, for me personally, teaching coaching so simple because people get it so easily. And I use that model all the time, and it resonates with people so much. So to begin, Haesun, the book's only been out a few months, and you mentioned that the publisher was quite taken with the response from people around the world. What do you think people are connecting with?
That's what I'm wondering about too. And, it was so cute. The publishers, they are so encouraging. And, it was so funny. The editor, she's the one who actually read through the manuscript, the rough one, the second one, the third one, like several times. And then whenever we actually meet, her solution focused coaching got better and better because she learned from the book. So by the time we were meeting for the last draft, she's like, so, what are you really hoping? And this and that. I'm like, wait a second, what are you doing? And she was actually able to host that kind of conversation by reading the book. And I wonder if that's what it is, that it's really simple in a way that people connect with the stories, that people, I think one of the things that the publisher also early on asked was, who's this book for? And I actually said, everybody. And they're like, no, 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 you can't do that. It doesn't sell like that. I said, but really, I want everyone to be able to pick it up and read. And I thought about, my dad, who I want him to be able to pick it up and actually read. I want my nephew to pick it up and read and actually get it without having to go to like a dictionary. So that's how it actually began. And maybe that's why it's attractive to people who just want to learn lightheartedly. Yeah.
And you've mentioned when we were talking previously that someone mentioned that I could just read a chapter and it was really easy to read. I can't remember the actual person you were talking about. That it was so brief, the chapters, it was really easy to get through for people.
Oh, yes, that was actually coming from, I think he's 83 and he just had a medical procedure and he couldn't really go anywhere and he was actually in bed. And he's like, and I was sort of in and out because of the pain medication. And he thanked me. He's like, thank you for keeping the chapter short because I could actually finish a chapter and remember the whole thing. And then the next chapter is another story. So he doesn't have to retain the storyline. And I thought, is that a compliment? Is that a, so I love that feedback actually. Yeah.
It's awesome. So I'm wondering for everyone here, have you done something with the book so far? Have you done anything with it?
I've revisited things. I think it's been a reinforcement. I wouldn't say there's I wouldn't necessarily say there's a lot new that I've come across, but there was stuff in my subconscious I've kind of forgotten about or I've thought about in the past. And the stories that Haesun put in there and caused me to think about my own stories, and then started to reflect on some of those words, which led to a broader thing. So it's a catalyst. I think it's just probably what you're trying to do with the book. I think it works really well.
Go, Di.
Well, what I've done is bought a copy of it for my daughter, who is retraining, so she's becoming an occupational therapist, and I can just see how it resonates with what she already talks about. So that's what I've done, because I'm immersed in this. I've bought a copy for her, and I'm just going to give it to her as a gift and say nothing more, because then she'll make her own meaning of it when she's ready.
Yeah. And for me, the second time through, because I thought, well, I better know a lot about it, given I'm interviewing you. So I refreshed my memory on everything in there. And it was so good going the second time through, because the stories came alive and it stuck with me more the second time. So I'm thinking about certain clients that I might be able to gift it to. So solution focus, for me, it brings it alive, brings solution focus alive so nicely. So
Actually, Annette, can I add to it?
Yeah.
By the way, if you hear whimpering, it's not me, it's my dog right beside me. She just got spayed yesterday. I just want to show you. So she is sitting here with me. So if you hear a whimper, it's not me, just so you know. So, here's what I actually did after I've written this book. There are a few people in the book that I actually wanted to find. So there is a story about my teacher, physics teacher from my high school. And he was pretty young at the time. So I thought hopefully he's not retiring. He didn't retire yet. And I found him. So I actually, he is at a different school, but not too far from him. So I called the school and I'm going to meet him next week. So I'm going to hand deliver the book to him. And he's a physics teacher. In the book, his name is Mr. Karuna, but real name is Mr. Caruana. And he's like, and that's how you mask my name? It's like, yeah, privacy. It's like, sure. So I'm going to be meeting him next week. It's been like 30 years. So we'll see. Yeah.
And he was the one, because I only just read that last night again. He was the one who then helped you use your real name rather than
yes, that's right. Exactly. And I don't even think that he knows that. So yeah, so I found him. I'm so happy.
That's so cool. So Haesun, what was your favorite chapter to write?
My favorite chapter, it's so funny. My favorite chapter to write, there are a couple actually, and one was my favorite, but the hardest, that I had to leave several times in the middle of it. I really didn't think I would include it. So that was hard to write. But what ended up being my favorite chapter is the X on a scale. The story about my dad and I renovating the bathroom. And, finding those growth chart on the wall. And really, we were like, what is this line? And my dad immediately, oh, it's their growth chart. And he just dropped everything and he just knelt on the ground and he's like, oh, the growth chart. And that really, I think, was my favorite chapter, because the whole scene just came right back to me. So yeah, that was my favorite chapter, along with a couple other, Memory of Dad. But yeah, that one.
Awesome. Well, mine was Becoming. Yeah. And the reason why I selected Becoming, it was just how profound, because you're talking about your dad's diagnosis with cancer, and even in that moment, you're able to be solution focused and ask him, you know, if suppose, you know, you said, suppose you have a couple of years left, and I'm sure you do, what would you do with that? And it shifted him to be thinking about travel. And he said he wanted to go to take your mum to Vienna, Paris, London, Cuba. And you were going like, they're quite different places, but he ended up going for a 2-week holiday with your mum to Cuba. Yeah.
And for the subsequent 2 years, he actually did go to every single one of those places.
Wow.
Yeah, we took a family trip to Budapest, Austria, and we actually did the whole tour, and every single place actually had a grave that he wanted to visit and pay tribute to. And I remember in Vienna, you know, in Vienna, they actually have this huge public cemetery. And I remember standing standing there surrounded by Beethoven here, Mozart here, Brahms there, and I'm standing there. And I saw my dad talking to Beethoven. I'm like, what is he actually saying? So I went up to him and I said, Dad, what are you saying? And he turned to me and he said, it's none of your business. So he took it so seriously that he really wanted to pay his tribute to, you know, people who he considers like his mentors. And he got to do that because of that conversation.
Yeah, that's incredible. But you also said in that chapter around, like, you're in your head when he was giving his response to the diagnosis, and you're going, that's regret, or that's dread, or that's hope, you know. And yeah, I was just so taken that you could be so present with what was happening for him, and also your description of with the doctor in terms of the diagnosis, and then you had to translate it as well. How did you do that? How were you able to still be in this place of being solution focused in spite of what was happening?
I think it's written that way, that it makes me look very good. Like, oh yeah, you know, I was being solution focused, but actually in the moment, it was just jumbled up everything. So I do remember, you know, when you are like, I don't think I've ever been in that kind of situation. I think I was in that situation when I thought I lost my dog once, but then, you know, when your hands are shaking and you sort of find yourself actually shaking, that I couldn't write down anything. So then the doctor took the notebook from me and she said, let me write it down for you. And that's how the whole situation, and I don't think I was actually thinking anything. and coming back home and sitting down with him now, that chapter is written in reflection, like afterwards, but in that moment was like, that's how I recall that I was speechless. I didn't know what to say truly. So in the moment, I don't think I was as, you know, logical and helpful at all. Yeah. Interesting, hey?
Yeah. And I'm wondering, because I'd read previously that you'd worked with palliative care patients, and you were able to have those conversations about hope with them as well. Can you share more about that situation?
You know, that actually was such an interesting experience, actually working at a hospital. And it was around the time when, you know, Canadian government actually legalized medical assistance in dying. So 2016. And I was brought in because when it was legalized, there are a lot of, you know, we have good plans. When we legalize something, of course, you teach this group of people this, you teach nurses this, and everyone is trained up to respond to patients. But actually on the floor, what was happening is patients are not talking to professionals. They're talking to people who are environmental services, who come in and clean the rooms, and they're volunteers, and their responses were not from the textbook. So I was brought in to address that and come up with some algorithm when patients are asking about that option. And for me, interviewing those patients actually taught me so much about how they want to die well. And, having that conversation using solution focus, we have algorithm now, all the Toronto area hospitals are using. But then when it came to my turn as a family member or a caregiver to have this conversation with my dad, everything just dropped. It's like, I don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
I don't know how many of you actually have that experience of, oh yeah, I totally do that with my clients, and you come home, it's like, I don't know how to do this.
Yeah.
I think that's what I experienced.
Yeah. Thank you. So, Haesun, in the opening chapter, you talk about not all narrative is curative. Instead of blindly believing that stories cure, talk therapy, we ought to seek those stories that cure, therapeutic talk. What have you found in the 10 years of researching how coaching conversations work? What have you found around this?
Oh, there are so many actually examples, especially in coaching, that I think somehow we, even our coaching modality is driven by what the society prioritizes or privileges. So in the society that I live in, I feel that we are still driven by productivity. Do more, and, be more and do more and be better and all those narratives. And I think that gets reflected in sort of untrained coaches' interventions. So people will say, so what do you want to achieve today? Is how some people actually begin their session. I'm like, oh, I want to achieve rest today. Like, why can't we privilege and prioritize rest? And coaches, so many people actually say that in the beginning. What do you want to achieve today? What goal do you have in mind? And it's so tiring. So that's one example. Another one is, I think when people actually invite the other person to talk more about something, I mean, our curiosity somehow makes us ask for information in some areas than other areas. And I experienced it like firsthand when I was grieving. I'm still grieving. Now I'm grieving differently, but 6 months in, it was the trickiest time, 6 months after my dad passed. Because by now I'm thinking I should be better. And there's the pressure of it's already been 6 months, I should be better. But it was actually worse. And then, I can't really talk about it anymore because it's kind of old news. And then that space was really difficult for me. And I remember going to or talking to a coach. And it's not solution focused, but happened to be just in passing. That coach asked me, so when will be a good time to move on? And I got livid and I told her, never. Never will be a good time to move on, ever. And do not invade my space ever again. I was so livid. Yeah. And I think that kind of experiences are not curative. And they actually do more harm than good, I think.
Yes.
So based on mostly actually looking at different types of coaching, people do whatever they call coaching, so to speak. But then also when I look at solution-focused approach, it's remarkable what we do in solution-focused, because we are pretty consistent in our approach, actually. We can take maybe, I don't know, 16 of us here, if we practice solution-focused, we are orienting in a more consistent direction in our selection of what to respond to, what we're asking for. And I think that's so powerful. And there's a reason for it. So, I think the quadrant that I introduced in the book, that quadrant didn't come out of just like thin air. It's built on the work of like people who have been doing this for a long time, including actually Mark McCurgo. I actually talk about his work actually in my thesis. And he has a model, it's orientation of our attention. And we talk about it in solution focus, but I think the quadrant can simplify that process. Yeah, but for me, if you just apply this quadrant and look at coaching that people do, it becomes so apparent, right? So anyway, I can go on and on and on about this, how coaching modalities really need to be, we need to be really diligent in studying. So yeah, I feel very, very passionate about it.
I would be interested to know about the connections between solution focus and approaches to adult learning, since that's what Haesun has done her PhD in.
Haesun.
I'm just wowing. What a brilliant question. Oh my goodness. By the way, Brian, here is a little sort of, I love this thing that Jenny actually did. When Jenny got her book, she started from J because her first name starts with J. And actually, I've been telling everyone, like, can you start with a chapter that starts, it's the same letter as your first name. So anyway, there you go. I think solution focused approaches actually is, well, adult learning actually is an interesting field because adult learning itself became a field because it came up to distinguish from children's learning. So pedagogy has been, the thing for many, many, many years. And then I think this German teacher, actually Alexander Kapp, I think his name, in late 1800s, actually wanted to distinguish how children learn to how adults learn. So he's the first person to come up with the term andragogy, as in learning of or teaching of men, versus pedagogy, as in teaching of children or boys. So then that term actually, since he first came up with the term, it was sort of dormant for many decades until, who was it? Malcolm Knowles, probably. So he's American.
Knowles.
Yeah, Knowles, yeah. So American psychologist, I think in 1960s, probably resurrect the term andragogy, and it becomes so popular. But what's so interesting is these days, something that's new, actually out of Australia, is happening in adult learning space called pedagogy. So whenever I hear pedagogy, we say, bless you. It's like pedagogy. Anyway, it's what we actually mean by, adult learning so far has been sort of, let's say pedagogy has been around the teacher teaching what kids should learn, so teacher-centered. Andragogy so far has been curriculum-centered. So here's a curriculum, you learn however way you want to learn. But now these days, pedagogy is actually the learner themselves just determining what they want to learn. In true form, it's learner-centered learning. Think about coaching. People who come to us, they have a topic that we probably know nothing about sometimes, and they want to learn. They want to get better at, or they want to make positive differences in. And I think the way that we facilitate the process is truly them becoming more aware, or them learning what they wanted to learn, and even beyond. And I think that's definitely connecting right there. If we are doing solution-focused approaches, whether it's counseling, therapy, coaching, consulting, I think people who are participating will actually learn something that is transformative. So I make the connection between SF approaches and transformative learning. And I think coaching is the vehicle that I actually chose to study. Hopefully that answers the question. I get excited about this thing.
Hey, son, how do you actually spell that word?
Pedagogy is it's spelled E-C-H-E-W. No, I'm kidding. It's echu. I just spelled. Pedagogy is spelled like, heuristic. We use, like, for example, eureka comes from the same root word as heuristic. So discovery tool. So when I introduce the DOQ, the quadrant, I often say this is a pedagogy. I mean, it is a heuristic for studying interaction. So it's a tool, right? So it's a HEUTA, Goji, I think. There you
Thank
go.
you.
I didn't expect to actually talk about that. Cool.
I happened to
Oh,
start the
thank
book with H because I have hope written outside the door of the house, and so I started with hope, and it ended up being my favorite chapter. And it's really because it demonstrates for me the power of SF. A lot of our life is about storytelling, whether it's informal or formal or anything like that. And often our stories look backwards initially. You know, we recall what happened in the past, and we talk about that. And I love the telephone call in that chapter where Haesun's just turned it around from a cold calling sort of salesman to say, well, what do you want to do? You know, is there any positive changes you want to make in your life? And all of a sudden, this guy has become the subject of the conversation, and he's starting to tell his own story, and it's future focused. And for me, I thought that's so often how we use SF, just to suddenly shift someone's mindset and to start thinking about the future rather than the past, but also, you know, reflecting on the past and what it brings. So yeah, that was really my favorite. And I love the comment Haesun just made about wanting some rest. I find that, you know, we're always chasing in life. We're always trying to catch up with other people, or trying to keep up with the Joneses or whatever, and trying to get that question of what do you want? You know, forget the comparisons, just what puts a smile on your face. But yeah, I read that chapter a couple of times. I really liked it. I didn't have a question, I'm afraid.
That's okay. That's okay. Thank you. Thank you.
I have a comment rather than a question.
Great. Thanks.
I think I haven't read the whole book yet, and I haven't read the story yet around your dad, Haesun, but just you telling it, I think it really connects with me, because my mum passed away in 2004, and I didn't learn solution focused until 2010. And I think that's one of the biggest regrets of my life, is that I didn't ask her good questions. You know, and I didn't think about what she needed or what I could have done to be more helpful for her in her last month, because it was a really quick journey. And so I think for me, even though that's a really horrible memory, it's something that's made me more determined to not miss opportunities in my life now, however they show up.
Thank you, Emma. Any other? Go, Annie.
I've underlined most of the chapter possible. So there's a sentence you wrote in there: dreams and dreads are similar in their magnitude. They're just different in their frequency. I thought that was absolutely beautiful. And in the conversation, you can follow the light rather than the shadow or the shadows. You can acknowledge the shadows as reflections of people standing facing the light. And I thought that's just a beautiful thing to remember as we're having these conversations that are sometimes weighing, like you can sense the weight, and then at the same time seeing it as looking towards or into the light even is really a beautiful image. So thank you for that. That was very nice. Yeah.
Oh, that's really nice, actually. Wow, I wrote
Yeah,
that.
amazing.
Maybe I should read what I wrote.
Moment.
It fits really well with the picture behind you, Annie. That's lovely on the wall as well.
Yeah, no, there's a bit of both. It's a choice.
So any other comments about favorite chapter or questions that you have?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, well, my favorite chapter, I don't even know which in terms of the alphabet this was, but where you were talking about visiting the physical therapist and the different people, how they asked different questions in response to what you were there for, and the impact those different kinds of questions had or might have, and that was just a really nice way of going through that those different approaches. I enjoyed that a lot, and I did have a possible question, which is what it would be like to use solution focused questions of the sort that, or the general orientation that you use in a context of nonviolent communication, where you're potentially in a conflict with someone and need to find out what they want and express what you want, and to navigate the conflict situation. And so I read a lot of the book from inquiring into that question myself.
I think, responding to the first part of what you mentioned about visiting my personal trainer, physical therapist, that was so interesting because there's another story that almost made the book, which is training my own family physician. He actually came to my training and he actually learned solution focused conversation, and he just annoyed the heck out of me. I hope he's not listening to this. But I booked an appointment. I show up because my wrist was hurting, and his first thing was, so what are you, how would you know that this was useful, blah, blah. And I'm like, listen, you got to diagnose me. So can you act properly? So he said, may I? I said, please diagnose me. We can dialogue later, but diagnose me. And he said, okay, so when did it begin to hurt? So he actually went to the whole actual physician talk. So I really, really appreciate actually people from healthcare coming in to learn this so that they can expand the space of dialogue in the diagnostic spaces. And I think when it comes to conflict too, that I think we just go right into conflict diagnosing and so on. But I think if we can expand that space of talking about, what's important to you, and here's what's important to me, I think that becomes a much better conversation. And I'll give you an example with my own conflict with sometimes my family members, because we have normal family. So we get into conflict. And, especially with the families, it's an ongoing thing. I think I know you, you've known me since I was born, because I'm the youngest. And then when we got into this huge argument with my brother, I said, okay, stop. And I said, let's try this. And remember that exercise from Solution Focus that we do, that we kind of like do the whole, you talk first and I'm going to summarize what I think you're saying that's important to you. And then I'm going to summarize it until, you agree to it. And I didn't think he would go for it, but he did. So then I said, okay, you go first. And he's like, blah, 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 blah. And not in a nice way. He's like, yelling at me. And I said, okay, you done? He's like, yeah, I'm done. And I said, so you said, and I summarized what he actually said because I was listening. And I said, so this is really important to you. And he's like, yeah, that's right. And then I said, okay. And then here's my story. So I started to tell my story. And of course, as a habit that we have in our interaction, he interrupted. I said, hey, here's the rule. I did it for you. You got to do it for me. He's like, fine. And then after I was done, I said, okay, so what did I say? And he did a good job summarizing what was important to me. And, it was not that different from what he wanted. What's important to me was also what was important to him. And we could actually have a much better conversation about it. So, that's one story that I can give you, Rush. I'm sure all of you actually have an experience experimenting with your family. So, hey, that's one from me.
Yeah. That's a work in progress, Haesun. Experimenting with my family.
I know, huh?
Zakana, you had a question or a favorite chapter? What?
Yes, I haven't read the book yet because I'm planning to read it on my holiday. But my question is, if there was sometimes a situation when where solution-focused questions would not be appropriate.
That's so cool. What a question, eh? Hey, what do you all think? You've done this and you've experienced it, and sometimes it's like, poof, okay, next
Sometimes
question.
it's so, yeah, sometimes it's so difficult. I'm not able to find some solution-focused question, but
Thank goodness.
maybe sometimes it is not possible. I don't know. I don't know if in any situations, for example, what you described in hospital with very serious ill person talking about future, it can be very courageous, you know, very how to say, I would not have courage for this.
You know, when you mentioned that, actually, I'm reminded of the work of Dwayne Bidwell. He's also a solution-focused practitioner. And he has worked with in pediatric hospitals with children with terminal diagnosis and their families, using a conversation that generates hope. And it's almost unthinkable. And how do we do that? I think, Zana, one of the things that I learned is I'm not sure what it means when people say solution-focused question. But I think what I know is solution-focused listening. So we can always listen for what people say they might want. But when it comes to set of questions that we may ask, there's, I think, 50-50 chance that it may or may not work, because it depends on the client's answer that we know if it worked or not. And I think for me, if you were to take some questions out of some books and say, hey, ask this. And that's why that person asked me while I was grieving. They say, when do you think might be a good time to move on? And I'm thinking, get lost, because that's not what I want. But if they simply listened, or maybe even invite me to say a little bit more about, you know, what would you, how would you like to remember this time as time really well spent? Now, that's a little bit different question, because then it will invite me to talk about what I really want. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe it's time that we need to move on, actually, from seeing solution focus as a question-based intervention, because I think that has worked so well so far. But now I think a lot of, you know, research from, let's say, microanalysis, for example, is showing that it's more about responding, not just questioning. So it will be really interesting to think about that, actually. Thank you for that question.
I might pick it up there, Haesun. Yeah, thank you, Zakana. You describe the quadrant as a listening quadrant rather than a questioning. And a lot of people get confused that think it is a questioning quadrant. So can you say more about that?
I think it's useful to organize as a, you know, what can we possibly ask as well. But I think primarily our main focus is actually on what the clients say, not what we say. So I think this tool is to really listen specifically to what the client says. And I think that's how we began. The whole solution-focused practice was born out of listening, listening to those moments when clients seem to make more progress, or maybe they feel better and so on. So for me, it's really getting back to, I think it was, what's his name? I was actually I think it was in Italy when we were talking about this idea of solution focus was born out of listening to our clients. And then now we actually have these wonderful tools Now we teach people the tools instead of teaching them how to listen. So then the moment that we actually turned from Jonas, well, actually said, I think we turned away from sharing solution focus as a learning model, what we turned away from it, and now we are actually sharing as a teaching. And we need to get back to how do we learn from our clients. So I think the way that I'm intending the quadrant to be used is your listening compass. So it's all about what the client says, and also using the compass, you can see how you are influencing that too. Because if you have a client who's consistently in quadrant 3 and 4, which is troubled past and dreadful future, you know, we have a few options. One, we can actually blame them for being so negative. It's like we have some negative clients. Or we can actually look at how we contributed to their narrative staying there. We did something. That's why they're staying there. So yeah, it's intended as a listening tool. Interesting, huh?
Definitely. I'm rethinking now how I teach SF just based on what you just said then. So yeah, thank you for that. I'm wondering firstly, is there any more favorite chapters or questions that you have of Haesun at this point?
You know, by the way, Annette, you know, also responding to Zana too, when we actually have patients talking about what they want is to die. Now, where do we put that on the quadrant? Is that quadrant 1? Is that quadrant 4? And I think that was the first time I actually noticed the dilemma in me, because I didn't want her to die. I didn't want to see her die, but she says she wants to die. She wants to finish well. And I had a hard time mapping it. But then simply listening to her narrative, she says, this is what I want. Then I need to learn to honor that. And that was really hard for me, by the way.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if where we go now, as a suggestion, Becoming was a chapter that I absolutely loved. And there is an exercise that we can do in breakouts, but I'm wondering if we first have a conversation about that chapter. And you said, Haesun, the radical acceptance of believing in others' becoming is the very glue that mends and bonds many relations we hold near. And your mum, I love the story about your mum, you know, asking you, who did you want to become? And you said King Arthur. And she then started calling you King Haesun for quite a while. And then you said, as you sit with your clients, how do you respond to their hopes and dreams as they share their preferred ways of doing their life? Do your habitual assumptions get in the way of believing that they are already well on the way? Can you expand on that for me, Haesun?
You know, I think it actually, the letter B almost didn't become becoming. And actually, it was many other things, including maybe the B is better. You know, what's better? You see the B word there? And I think another B word was believe. And, you know, I chose becoming. But I think that actually came from, I was talking to Peter DeYoung, who actually said, well, when clients say this is what they want, do you actually believe them? And I'm like, what? What do you mean? And his question really shook me up, because the question is, do you actually believe that they have their logic of doing their life and they know better than you do? And, you know, becoming is not a static thing. It's a movement. It's becoming something. I look at my nephews and they're becoming teenagers, and they're becoming many other things as we speak. And, you know, one lesson that I learned from my mom, and we were just walking the other day, my mom and I, and she said, well, isn't that interesting that you have become everything that I called you? And I'm like, what do you mean? And she said, I used to, when you're growing up, I remember addressing you as Dr. Moon, and hey, here you are. And I'm like, oh, and she says, and also when you wanted to be a journalist, writer, she addressed me by that each and every time. And she said, now you have become everything that I've called you. And now what do you want me to call you?
Wow.
And I thought, my goodness, you just don't give up hoping. And it's not in a pressuring way, but it's really like, she's so hopeful. Now what? And I actually really had to think about it. I said, Mom, let me get back to you on that. And holding that sort of, the people in front of us, they are actually becoming, they're in the middle of, selving process. They're becoming more of them in the process of this conversation. I think it's on a philosophical level, it's kind of enticing, but on a practical level, very hard to do. Because my assumptions always get in the way. And I'm like, why would you want that? So I think that's one of the chapters that I actually thought practically challenging, even now, especially when I talk to my nephews and they say this and that. I'm like, but why would you want that? So do I actually believe that they have the logic of doing their life?
Love it. John, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Haesun, that's really interesting. This was one of the chapters that I found, excuse me, very thought-provoking. And another B word that kept coming out as I read it was bias. And you've been kind of alluding to that in the last couple of minutes, or more accurately, I suppose, unconscious bias. So it kind of brackets you before the B. How do you deal, or how do you address, how do you reflect on your own biases? How much do you explore, probably building a little bit on what you've just been saying, that how do I know where my biases sit before I even meet a client? As soon as I go into a room and I look at someone, am I already starting to make assumptions that I shouldn't? How do you deal with that?
Oh, I would love to learn from all of you actually about how you deal with it too. I remember this phone call that I had to have with a professor that I actually couldn't stand. And he wanted to chat. I'm like, I can't. I'm so not looking forward to it, and I can't stand it. And I remember just like, oh man. And as I was getting ready to have this conversation, it was a phone call, so he cannot see my face, which is a good thing because I rolled my eyes. And as I was getting into the meeting, I said, okay, hold on a second. This is not the most respectful way to meet the person, and I don't want to waste my time. So it's not because I'm a nice person I did this. It's just to serve myself. I don't want to, I want to enjoy the call as much as I could. So I took out my notebook, and on top of my notebook, I actually said, okay, what is he saying that he wants? I wrote it. And then what's important to him? And then I actually made a note to myself, repeat after that. So I wrote those 3 lines, and then we started the phone call. And the minute he said, hello, I'm like, I can't stand you. But then I actually went back to my notes and I really listened to what he said that he wanted. And also I listened to what's important to him, and I repeated that when he actually mentioned it, because I think solution focused question will flop. But what always works is repeating back the client's wants back to them and say, so it sounds like you really care about this. And he said, yes. And doing that maybe 3-4 times, I started to actually like him. During that phone call, I'm like, I kind of like this guy. I mean, he actually wants what's really, noble. So really, it's such a small practice that I tried. But then our relationship after that 20-minute phone call, almost there is healing. But then he doesn't know that, but I know that. So John, I think that's what really helped me actually with my own bias.
Love that. So as you reflect on how far you've traveled on your own path of becoming who you are today, you may recall others who believed in you along the way. The questions are, what characteristics, interests, and passions show up early in your life that signal you're becoming who you are today? And then the second question is, what are some small and big dreams that came true? Who believed in you or who believed in you or believed in, I don't know why I got that wrong. What difference did it make having someone that believed in you? So I'd love you to share what impact did that conversation have on you, and what connections did you make? Because I made a connection that I would never have thought of.
There's just that question. We had the question, who really believed in you? And I personally don't really feel like I had anybody in my family. My family operated in the opposite. If you started doing really well, they put you down, and that was a way of showing love. As every family does, well, I know they care for me because they can put me down really well. Which, I've grown used to that. So, and so where does it come from then if you don't have those sorts of people in your life, like Haesun's mum and Josie's mum, who just thought she was amazing as well, and pumped her up and gave her lots of confidence. So where does that come from then? And for me, it's probably just my competitive nature. And then you pick up, it's like those love languages, you pick up on words of encouragement when they're spoken, because it's just like, oh, that felt nice. And when someone said you did a good job, you go, oh yeah, I'm going to carry on doing a good job, and I want to do a better job. So that's where our conversation went. What would you say, Haesun, asking your, expert opinion? Where do you get it if you don't have people necessarily around you?
That's such a great question. Wow. I was just, talking to Annette and Annie and Brian about my guidance counselor when I was 17 and I was new to Canada, and she actively, in her way of showing love and support, she said, well, you probably should really pursue like university studying science, because you will never be able to speak English. So why don't you actually go into science and not teaching or speaking? I'm like, okay. So I went into science and studied neuroscience, like carrying that message with me for a decade. And I think I know that weight of words that people offer us. And I think sometimes we carry it. And I think we also have a choice of leave it. So, yeah, I think that's so interesting that you talk about that, Matt.
So we can open it up now to what's been useful for this conversation today. What's really becoming clearer to you about solution focus and the way of having these conversations? What's become clearer?
I'll offer something.
Thanks, Laura. And nice to meet you, Laura.
Nice to meet you too. The part about listening versus questioning. And I'm going to, when as a coach, sitting with someone and coming into the room with your own assumptions and your own filters and how you hear and see the world. This tool, the quadrant, I find where I'm going now with the quadrant is it's going to help me remove my filters, these assumptions that I bring without even realizing that they're there. By focusing on listening to what they want and using that tool, I think I can get outside of myself, like sort of not be trying to understand or appreciate or figure it out and all that stuff. What did they actually say? But just actually removing the filter. That's what's coming up for me, is these filters are being removed for me so that I can listen in a different way. Yeah. Thank you, Haesun. That was so cool. You've
actually made a connection for me, Laura. Thank you. I do a lot of work in the construction industry, and there's a big emphasis on helping with unconscious bias that happens for women in construction. And I'm just made the connection. I think this is a lovely way of helping with that, of helping how do you listen for what people want. And so those conversations between a male supervisor and a female employee in construction can totally flip this around. So just from what you said, Laura, thank you. I've made that connection. I might be doing more of that. Thank you. What else is, Emma, you've got your...
I just want to echo that too. I think I work for police, and so unconscious bias is a huge thing that is often talked about in the organisation, but which mostly consists of telling people how the brain creates bias and actually not much in the way of what you do about it. But I think, and in the midst of developing the coaching framework for them, Haesun, just to let you know that next week, going to be explicitly using your quadrant. So we've got 120 new police officers to train. So they'll be being able to go out there and use it. And I think, the listening stuff around getting them to think more about that it is about listening, but it's not about listening for information around laying charges or anything like that. It's about broadening their thinking around why are you a police officer. And it's not, I don't think many of them join police because they really want to arrest somebody. I think it's they want to help people. And so if they can listen or learn to listen for what would be helpful, we might change the whole organisation. Well, that's aspirational, but I can't help myself. So I think just putting the quadrant in there as much as possible, because I think it's really accessible. People can go out and start using it, and it will create some of the culture change that we want as well.
Emma, that really excites me, because I think especially the quadrant actually is designed to impact your micro interactions, because micro interactions become patterns. I think we have patterns with our friends and family because those micro interactions accumulated. I think at workplace, those micro interactions, when they accumulate, micro conversations, they become culture. So I totally agree with you, Emma, that by doing that, you will be impacting the culture for sure. Wow. Huh.
And connected to that, I do a lot of work with safety professionals and helping them flip it to, be a risk focus and what's wrong. They can start to then notice, oh, in this construction site, we're actually making progress in this area. How come? So they're actually inquiring in and supporting people to look differently at how safety is done, and so that they take responsibility for safety. And they do that through learning about the quadrant. Yeah. So our time's nearly up. Any further questions that you have of Haesun at this point? Annie.
So I believe to have heard that you were working on this a few years ago, and that it's now published and it's out there. And my question is, what is it that you're working on now that we might find maybe 2 or 3 years down the road? So where is your journey going, and what's next for you?
My immediate next is enjoy the summer and, all those things. But I actually don't know, Annie, but I think right now I am getting increasingly, there's this term by Bill Hybels called holy discontentment. So I have this holy discontentment in the field, how right now it feels like anything goes. And I really want to bring that scientific lens to the science, as in, how do we know that, like, science is very simple to me. Like, science is like, if you do this, then this happens. And how do we know that that's what happens? So It's like when we say, if you do coaching, then this happens. How do we know that? And how do we know that anything to do, that has anything to do with you? So I really would love to see how we can make this coach training, adult education, counseling thing lighthearted in a way that it's evidence-based, but lighthearted. I think both can coexist. So that's currently what I'm really, really interested in. That, yeah, I think that's something that I am playing with and start discovering different things. And, you know, actually it's so interesting, Annie, because another one that I thought about is having a conversation about grieving, and grieving of many kinds, because I went through grieving. I'm still going through it. And I think doing this quadrant work, I'm still learning each time I use it, but sometimes it feels like conversation is like a minefield of memories, like especially people who are grieving. Like the books, I have finished the book and I couldn't read it for 3 months because stories triggered me. I'm like, okay, I can't do this. So still, it's very active. The minefield is very active. And then how do we actually engage people in these situations on an ongoing basis? So that's also something that my heart is sort of, that's where my heart is tugged as well.
I want to do a big thank you, Haesun, for today's session. I now have realized I'm an Olympian. I never knew that before today's conversation. Sharing with everyone that when I was a child, I wanted to be an Olympian, but didn't know what sport. And now I feel like I've arrived at being an Olympian because I can compete in ocean swim events and I feel like an Olympian. So who'd have known that we would have got to that place at the end of the conversation? So thank you so much, Haesun, and thank you everyone for your contribution today. It's been I've really enjoyed it, and I hope you've enjoyed it as well. So thank you so much. Big thank you.
Got it.
Thank you so much, Haesun. What a wonderful conversation today. It's been a privilege.
Oh, thank you for taking your time. Actually, I love talking with people, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great
day, great evening, great morning. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.